Evelyn Gray stood at the kitchen window, watching 7-year-old Alvin play soccer in the backyard of their small house in suburban Houston. The July evening sun was coloring the grass with golden hues, and the children's laughter echoed around the neighborhood. The woman smiled involuntarily, looking at the boy who was trying with such passion to score a goal in a makeshift goal made of 2 old chairs. It was hard to believe that it had been 3 years since Alvin had become part of their family. Evelyn remembered every detail of that terrible day when she had first seen him. The boy had been only 4 years old then, sitting on the porch of the Child Services house, clutching a tattered teddy bear tightly to him. His big brown eyes stared in disbelief at all the adults who tried to talk to him. The story began 3 years earlier, when Evelyn, returning from a night shift at the clinic, noticed that the lights in the house next door had not been turned off for the 3rd day, and that garbage was piling up in the yard. The house then belonged to 26-year-old Macy Lester, a single mother who was increasingly drunk. Evelyn repeatedly saw the woman staggering around the yard, talking loudly to herself, while her young son looked out the window with a frightened face. On that fateful day, Evelyn decided to see if everything was okay. She knocked on the door of a neighbor's house, but no one answered. So she walked around and peered through the living room window. What she saw made her heart clench with horror. 4-year-old Alvin was sitting on the floor amidst scattered toys and food scraps. The child was dirty, thin, and his clothes looked like they hadn't been changed in days. Evelyn immediately called Child Services. When the social workers opened the door, it turned out that the boy had been alone in the house for 3 days, eating leftover bread and cookies he could find in the kitchen. Macy Lester had disappeared without leaving any trace. It was later revealed that she had eloped with her new lover, Taylor Morris, a 30-year-old man with a criminal record whom she had met in a bar. The adoption process took almost a year. Evelyn and her husband Dylan fought through the courts, went through endless background checks, and filled out mountains of paperwork. They were ready to give Alvin what he had been denied: a real family, love and care. Dylan, who worked as a mechanic at the local oil refinery, at first doubted whether they could handle raising someone else's child. But when he saw Alvin smile at Evelyn for the first time, all doubts disappeared. The boy adapted slowly. For the first few months he flinched at sudden sounds, was afraid to be alone even for a few minutes, and often woke up at night with nightmares. Evelyn, through her experience as a nurse, realized that the baby needed time to learn to trust again. She patiently sat by his bedside until he fell asleep, read him stories, and gradually helped him forget the traumas of the past. Dylan turned out to be a wonderful father. He taught the boy how to ride a bike, play baseball, and fix simple things around the house. On weekends, they built bird houses together or worked in the small vegetable garden behind the house. Alvin blossomed in front of his eyes, transforming from an intimidating toddler to a cheerful child. The neighbor's house stood empty all these 3 years. Occasionally, some people, apparently relatives or acquaintances of Macy's, came and took the rest of her belongings, but she never showed up again. Evelyn secretly hoped it would always be that way. Alvin barely remembered his birth mother. A 4-year-old's memory quickly erases traumatic memories, replacing them with new, happy moments. Now, looking at the boy playing in the yard, Evelyn felt pride and gratitude. Alvin did well in school. He made friends. He was involved in the swimming section at the local sports center. His teacher often praised his diligence and kindness to his classmates. To everyone around him, he was just a son of the Grays, and no one questioned his origins. "Mom, is dinner ready?" Alvin came running to the kitchen window, flushed from play and covered with grass. "Go wash your hands. We'll have supper now," Evelyn said affectionately. Dad had already come home from work. Dylan had indeed just returned from the factory. Evelyn heard him changing his clothes in the upstairs bedroom. Soon the whole family was gathered around the dinner table. Dylan talked about the problems with the new equipment at the plant. Alvin shared his impressions of the school day, and Evelyn listened to them, enjoying these ordinary but so important moments of family life. It was about 9 o'clock in the evening when they finished supper. Alvin went upstairs to do his homework, and Evelyn began washing the dishes. Dylan settled down in the living room in front of the television, watching the evening news. Dusk was slowly fading outside the window, and the usual evening silence reigned in the house. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a loud banging coming from somewhere outside. Evelyn raised her head, listening. The sound was repeated. Someone was obviously walking through the neighbor's house and moving something around or throwing it on the floor. "Dylan, do you hear that?" she called out to her husband. Dylan turned off the TV and listened. There were strange noises coming from the empty Lester house, creaking floorboards, thumps, and then muffled voices. "Some of the relatives must have come to get the rest of their things," he suggested, but there was uncertainty in his voice. The sounds grew louder and louder. There were two voices, one male and one female. The woman was shouting something unintelligible, and the man was answering her rudely. Evelyn and Dylan looked at each other. In 3 years, they had grown accustomed to the silence of the neighbor's house, and the sounds seemed especially disturbing in the darkness of the night. "Let's go see what's going on," Dylan decided. They quietly left the house and cautiously approached the fence that separated their plots. The windows of the neighbor's house glowed dimly. Someone must have turned on the electricity. The silhouettes of 2 men could be seen through the loose curtains in the living room, looking for something, turning over furniture and rummaging through drawers. "Where can he be?" A woman's voice sounded, and Evelyn felt her heart twitch. The voice sounded familiar, though in 3 years she might have forgotten its peculiarities. "Calm down, we'll find it," the man answered gruffly. "The documents should be here somewhere." The couple stood in the shadow of their house, hesitating to come closer. It was clear that the people in the neighboring house were looking for something specific, and their behavior did not inspire confidence. After about half an hour, the house became quiet, and the lights went out. Evelyn and Dylan had already returned home when they heard the gate creak and footsteps heading toward their house. The sharp ringing of the doorbell made them flinch. Dylan went to the door first and cautiously peered through the peephole. What he saw made him go pale. "Evelyn, it's her," he said quietly to his wife. "Macy Lester." Evelyn felt the ground go from under her feet. 3 years of quiet living, 3 years during which they had hoped the past would never return, had ended in an instant. The bell rang again, more insistent. "Open up! I know you're home!" came a drunken woman's voice. Dylan looked at his wife. They both realized that hiding was pointless. Sooner or later, they would have to face the past. He slowly opened the door, leaving the chain behind. In the narrow slit showed the face of a woman who had changed a lot in 3 years. Macy Lester looked much older than her 29 years. Her face was puffy, her hair dull and unkempt, and her eyes were bloodshot. Standing next to her was a tall man with tattoos on his arms and an unkind expression. "I'm Macy Lester," the woman said, trying to speak clearly, but the alcohol was making her speech slurred. "I lived in that house. I had a son, a little boy, Alvin." Evelyn squeezed her husband's hand. Her heart was beating so hard she feared it would be audible. "What do you want?" Dylan asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "I want to know where my son is." Macy raised her voice, and Taylor put a hand on her shoulder, calling for silence. 3 years ago, I went away for a while, and when I came back, the house was empty. The neighbors said it had been taken. But by who? Where? Evelyn and Dylan looked at each other. They had a decision to make right now, and their family's fate depended on it. "Child Services took the child away 3 years ago," Dylan said slowly. "We don't know what happened to him. He was probably taken into foster care, but we don't know to whom." Macy stared at his face, trying to see if he was telling the truth. "Are you sure you don't know?" she asked again. "Maybe one of the neighbors heard something?" "No," Evelyn answered firmly. "After they took him away, no one said anything else. That's confidential information." Taylor, who had been silent until then, leaned over to Macy and said something quietly in her ear. The woman nodded. "All right," she said, "but if you find out anything, if you hear anything, please tell me. I'll be living in that house for a while longer." With those words, they turned and walked back to the Lester house. Dylan closed the door and turned all the locks. Evelyn leaned against the wall, feeling her hands shaking. They had lied to the woman who, for all her faults, was Alvin's biological mother. But they had no choice. Too much was at stake. Too fragile was the happiness they had spent 3 years building. "Did we do the right thing?" she asked her husband quietly. Dylan put his arm around her shoulders. "We're protecting our son," he said. Alvin is happy with us. He doesn't even remember her. Why ruin his life for the whim of a woman who left him alone in an empty house? There was a creaking sound upstairs. Alvin must have been getting ready for bed. Fortunately, he heard nothing. For the time being, their secret was safe. The next 2 weeks passed in anxious anticipation. Evelyn and Dylan tried to behave as usual, but both felt a threat looming over their family. Macy and Taylor had moved into a neighbor's house, and now there were regular sounds of their presence: loud music at night, swearing, the sound of bottles breaking. Alvin had asked several times who lived in the house that had been empty for so long, but his parents had been evasive, saying that temporary tenants had moved in. Evelyn noticed that Macy often stood at the window, watching their house. The woman clearly didn't believe their words completely and kept looking for some sort of confirmation. Several times, Evelyn saw Macy approach other neighbors, questioning them about something. But those, fortunately, knew little about little Alvin's fate. Most of the residents of the street had changed in the 3 years since, and the new neighbors were not aware of the adoption story at all. Dylan started coming home from work earlier than usual, trying not to leave his wife and son alone. He also asked the neighbor to his right, an elderly Mr. Collins, to keep an eye on the house in his absence. The old man, a retired policeman, immediately realized that something serious was going on, although Dylan did not go into details. Alvin didn't suspect anything yet. He was still playing, going to school, going out with his friends. The only thing that bothered him was the strange behavior of his parents, who became overprotective of him, not allowing him to leave the house and constantly asking where he was. That all changed on Thursday night. Dylan was late at the plant because of an equipment accident, and Evelyn was preparing dinner when there was a sharp, demanding knock at the door. Not a bell, but a pounding. Someone was pounding on the wooden door with such force that the whole frame shook. Evelyn looked out the living room window and saw Macy and Taylor on the porch. The woman looked even worse than she had 2 weeks ago. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes were dirty, and she noticed a baseball bat in Taylor's hands. "Open up!" Macy shouted, her voice full of rage. "I know you lied to me! Open up right now!" Evelyn grabbed her cell phone, preparing to call the police, but she didn't have time to dial the number. Taylor hit the door with the bat as hard as he could, and the lock failed. The door swung open, and the 2 intruders burst into the house. "Where is he?" Macy screamed, looking around the living room with wild eyes. "Where is my son? I know he's here!" Taylor didn't say a word, but began methodically smashing everything around him. He smashed the glass door of a sideboard with a bat, knocked over a coffee table, threw a vase of flowers to the floor. Shards flew all over the room, and Evelyn pressed herself against the wall, not knowing what to do. "Stop!" she shouted. "You have no right! I'm calling the police!" "Call whoever you want," Macy snapped at her. "But first, I want my baby back. I found out the truth. Old Mrs. Johnson from down the street remembers everything. She saw you fiddling with some boy in her yard, a dark-skinned boy about the right age." Evelyn's heart sank. Mrs. Johnson had indeed lived on the next street over for many years and could remember the arrival of a child in the Gray family 3 years ago. "It's not your son," Evelyn tried to remain calm. "We have documents." "What papers?" Macy came close, smelling strongly of alcohol and unwashed body odor. "Show me that boy, right now." Taylor, meanwhile, continued to smash furniture. He smashed the TV with a bat, knocked over a bookcase, and books scattered across the floor. The sound of breaking glass and falling furniture was deafening. It was at that moment that footsteps were heard upstairs, and Alvin started down the stairs. The boy apparently heard the noise and decided to see what was going on. Evelyn wanted to shout to him to come back into the room, but it was too late. Alvin appeared in the doorway of the living room and froze when he saw the mayhem and the strangers. His big brown eyes widened with horror and his face turned pale. In his hands, he clutched tightly the same teddy bear that Evelyn had first seen him with 3 years ago. Macy turned around at the sound of footsteps and froze. She stared at the boy in silence for a few seconds, and then her face contorted with emotion, a mixture of joy, pain, and despair. "Alvin," she whispered. "My little Alvin." She took a step toward the child, holding out her arms, but the boy instinctively pulled back, pressing himself against the wall. His lips trembled and his eyes filled with tears of fear. "Don't be afraid, baby." Macy tried to make her voice affectionate, but the alcohol and emotion made it hoarse and frightening. "It's me, your mommy, your real mommy." Alvin shook his head and pressed himself even harder against the wall. He didn't recognize this woman, didn't understand who she was or why she was destroying his home. To him, Evelyn was his mother, the one who read him stories, treated him when he was sick, walked him to school every morning. "Mom," he said to Evelyn, his voice trembling with fear, "who are these people? Why are they breaking our things?" Macy heard the boy call Evelyn mommy, and her face contorted with rage. "I'm your mommy," she shouted. "Not her, me! I gave birth to you! You're my son!" She tried to grab Alvin's hand, but the boy broke free and ran to Evelyn, hiding behind her back. Evelyn hugged him tightly, feeling the little body trembling. "Don't touch him!" she shouted. "You're frightening the child!" "Scaring?" Macy was on the verge of hysterics. "I'm his mother! I have the right to take my son away!" Taylor, who had been silently watching the scene all this time, walked over to Macy and put his hand on her shoulder. "Calm down," he said. "We found the kid. Now we need to be smarter." He turned to Evelyn, cold determination in his eyes. "Listen carefully," he said slowly. "Macy is the biological mother of this child. We have the birth certificate. If you don't hand the kid over voluntarily, we'll go to court. And believe me, the court will side with the birth mother." "We have the adoption papers," Evelyn replied firmly. "Alvin is legally our son." "We'll see," Taylor grinned. "In the meantime, we'll keep an eye on you, very closely." At that moment, sirens sounded outside. Evelyn managed to press the emergency button on her phone before they broke into the house, and the police finally arrived. "Police!" came a loud voice from the street. "Come out with your hands up!" Taylor cursed and threw the bat to the floor. Macy cast one last glance at Alvin, who was still hiding behind Evelyn's back. "This isn't over," she hissed. "I'm not leaving my son with strangers." They quickly headed toward the back exit of the house. Taylor pushed open the door to the kitchen, and the two disappeared into the darkness of the backyard. By the time the police had circled the house, the fugitives had already disappeared into the maze of alleys and yards. Dylan arrived home a half hour after the police arrived. When he saw the trash in the living room and the police interviewing his wife, he turned pale. Evelyn told him and the officers what had happened, but left out the most important part, that Macy was really Alvin's mother. The cops recorded a report of trespassing and property damage, promised to step up patrols in the neighborhood, and left. Dylan boarded up the broken door, and Evelyn tried to remove the largest pieces and clean up the house. Alvin stayed close to his foster parents all evening. He helped sweep up the shards and watched his father fix the furniture in silence, but it was obvious that the boy was very frightened. Before going to bed, he could not sleep for a long time, constantly asking if these scary people would return. "Who is that woman?" he asked as Evelyn tucked him into bed. "Why did she say she was my mom? I have a mom. That's you." Evelyn felt her heart constrict. She didn't know how to answer that question without destroying the child's world or saying too much. "There are people who sometimes say things that aren't true," she said carefully. "This woman is sick, and she is confusing you with someone else. Don't think about it, little one. We'll protect you." Alvin nodded, but it was clear on his face that he didn't fully understand what was happening. He hugged his teddy bear tighter and closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come to him for a long time. The next day, Macy did not appear near their house, but Evelyn saw her silhouette in the windows of the neighbor's house. The woman was obviously watching, waiting for the right moment. By evening, Dylan had installed additional locks on the doors and bars on the first-floor windows. 2 more days of relative calm passed. Alvin went to school under the supervision of Evelyn, who took a leave of absence from work. Dylan had negotiated a reduced workday with his bosses. They were careful not to leave the boy alone for even a minute. On Saturday morning, when the whole family was having breakfast in the kitchen, Alvin suddenly went to the window and froze. "Mom, that woman is here again," he said quietly. Evelyn and Dylan went to the window. Macy was standing on the sidewalk right in front of their house, leaning against a lamppost. She was wearing an old jacket and jeans, her hair carelessly gathered into a ponytail. She had a bag of food in her hands and was chewing slowly, keeping her eyes on their house. How much is it worth? Dylan asked. I noticed her an hour ago when I got up, Evelyn said. She just stands there and stares. Dylan felt his anger boiling over. This woman had terrorized his family, frightened his child, destroyed their home, and now she was stalking them. I'll talk to her, he said firmly, heading for the door. Dylan, don't. Evelyn tried to stop him. Let's call the police. For what? For standing on a public sidewalk? Dylan shook his head. No, I'll take care of it myself. He stepped out of the house and walked briskly toward Macy. The woman saw him and straightened up, preparing to speak. Get out of here, Dylan said, coming within arm's length. Stop watching our house. This is a public place, Macy replied, her voice surprisingly sober. I have a right to be here. You're scaring the kid, Dylan tried to speak calmly, but there was tension in his voice. He's afraid to go out in the yard, afraid to go to school. What are you trying to accomplish? I want my son back, Macy answered simply. I made a mistake 3 years ago. I was young, stupid, in love. But now I've changed. I want to make up for my mistake. Changed? Dylan couldn't contain his sarcasm. You broke into our house with a bat, trashed half the furniture, scared a kid to death. That's what you call change? Macy lowered her eyes. I was drunk, she admitted. Taylor said you wouldn't understand any other way. But I really want to take Alvin. He's my son, my only child. Where have you been for 3 years? Dylan asked. Where were you when he cried himself to sleep with nightmares? Where were you when he was sick? Where were you when he was taking his first steps in school? Macy stammered. I was trying to get my life together. I thought it was best for him. It would have been better for him if you hadn't left him alone in an empty house, Dylan said stiffly. Do you know what condition we found him in? He was dirty, hungry, scared. For 3 days, a 4-year-old had been locked in a house without food or water. Macy shuddered like she'd been slapped. I didn't know it would be this long, she muttered. We were going to be back in a day. But we didn't, Dylan interrupted her. In the meantime, Alvin had learned not to trust adults, learned to fear being alone, learned to expect to be abandoned again. It took us months for him to become a normal kid again. Macy was silent, tears streaming down her cheeks. I realize I was a bad mother, she finally said. But people change. I don't drink anymore, hardly anymore. Taylor found a job. We can give Alvin a normal life. He already has a normal life, Dylan replied. He has a home, a family that loves him, school, friends. Why ruin all that? At that moment, Taylor came out of the neighboring house. He slowly approached them, and Dylan sensed the danger. The man was not holding a bat, but a tire iron, a heavy iron stick that could seriously cripple a man. Is there a problem, Macy? Taylor asked, keeping his eyes on Dylan. No problem, the woman answered quickly. We're just talking. This conversation is over, Dylan said, and turned to leave. Taylor stepped forward, blocking his path. I don't think we're done talking yet, he said, fiddling with the tire iron. Macy has a right to see her son. According to the law, she has to get permission from the court, Dylan answered, trying not to show fear. Until then, she has no rights. The law, Taylor grinned contemptuously. Does the law know you stole someone else's baby? We didn't steal him. We adopted him through child services according to the rules. We'll see what the court says. Taylor stepped aside to make way. But you know, buddy, we're not going anywhere. We're gonna live next door and keep an eye on our boy. Dylan walked past him and headed quickly toward the house. His heart was pounding frantically, and his mind was spinning with one thought. Something had to be done, or these people would not leave them alone. Evelyn met him at the door with concern in her eyes. What did they say? She asked. They won't let up, Dylan answered. We have to call a lawyer. If they go to court, we have to be ready. Alvin sat in the living room in front of the TV, but it was obvious that he wasn't interested in cartoons. He kept glancing at the windows, obviously afraid that the scary people would show up again. Mom, he approached Evelyn when his parents had finished talking. Is that woman really my mom? Evelyn sat down next to him on the couch and put her arm around his shoulders. Alvin, sometimes in life there are difficult situations that are hard to explain, she began cautiously. This woman? Yes, she gave birth to you. But being a mom isn't just about giving birth to a baby. Being a mom is about caring, loving, protecting every day. The boy frowned, trying to understand. "But why did she leave me?" he asked quietly. "Why didn't she take care of me?" "She was very sick," Evelyn explained. "Not physically, but in her head. And she couldn't take care of you the way she needed to. So you were handed over to us, and we became your real family. And now she wants to take me away?" You could hear the fear in Alvin's voice. "We won't let that happen," Dylan said firmly, coming toward them. "You're our son, and we won't give you up to anyone. I promise." Alvin nodded, but it was clear from the look on his face that the thought of his birth mother bothered him deeply. For the rest of the day, he stayed close to his foster parents, afraid to be alone even for a few minutes. In the evening, when the boy finally fell asleep, Evelyn and Dylan sat down at the kitchen table to discuss the way forward. They realized that the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous and drastic measures had to be taken to protect their family. The next week passed in tense anticipation. Evelyn took a few more days of vacation so as not to leave Alvin alone, and Dylan made an appointment with a lawyer. The lawyer assured them that the adoption papers were correct and fully enforceable, but warned that the birth parents had the right to sue for restoration of parental rights, especially if they could prove that they had changed their lifestyle. Macy and Taylor no longer appeared directly outside the house, but their presence was felt constantly. There were sounds from the neighboring house, lights on late at night, and sometimes Evelyn noticed someone watching them from behind the curtains. Alvin became more withdrawn, often waking up at night and refusing to play in the yard during the day without adult supervision. On Monday morning, something happened that everyone dreaded, but no one expected it to happen this way. The day started as usual. Dylan left for work, having checked all the locks once again and asked Mr. Collins, the neighbor, to be especially attentive. Evelyn made breakfast, took Alvin to school, and came home to do housework. The boy was due home from school at 3:30, as usual. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Evelyn went out into the yard to water the flowers in the flower bed. She noticed that the neighbor's house seemed unusually quiet. No sounds, windows tightly closed with curtains. That struck her as odd, but she decided not to pay much attention to it. Alvin came home from school at exactly the right time, cheerful and lively. There was a math test at school, and he was sure he had done well. After lunch, the boy asked permission to play in the yard with a soccer ball. "Just don't leave the yard," Evelyn warned him. "And if anything seems strange to you, run straight home." "Okay, Mom." Alvin nodded and ran outside with the ball in his hands. Evelyn watched him from the kitchen window while preparing dinner. The boy raced the ball merrily between the makeshift goalposts, occasionally turning to her and waving. About 4 o'clock, the phone rang. A friend from work called, and they talked about hospital matters. The conversation dragged on for about 15 minutes. When Evelyn hung up the phone and looked out the window again, the yard was empty. A ball lay in the middle of the lawn, but Alvin was nowhere to be seen. At first she didn't worry. She thought the boy had come into the house through the back door, but after checking all the rooms, she realized he wasn't home. Her heart began to pound frantically. "Alvin!" she shouted, running out into the yard. "Alvin, where are you?" There was no answer. She ran around the lot, looked behind the barn, checked all the places where the boy might be hiding. He was nowhere to be found. Evelyn ran outside and started calling for her son even louder. Her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who lived across the street, came up to her. "Mrs. Gray, what's wrong?" she asked with concern. "Alvin has disappeared." Evelyn was on the verge of panic. "He was playing in the yard. I was distracted for a few minutes, and now he's gone." "I saw it," Mrs. Patterson said suddenly, and her face grew serious. "About 20 minutes ago, I was washing the windows, and I noticed a dark van pull up outside your house. 2 people got out of it, and then it drove away quickly. It seemed strange to me, but I thought it was someone you knew." Evelyn felt the ground slipping away from under her feet. She immediately pulled out her cell phone and dialed the emergency number. "Police? My son has disappeared. He's been kidnapped," she said, her voice shaking with fear and rage. The police arrived 10 minutes later. A patrol car was the first to arrive, and soon 2 more cars pulled up, including the detective's car. One of them, a large man of about 45 with graying temples, introduced himself as Detective Garrett Blake. Tell me everything from the beginning, he said, pulling out a notebook. When was the last time you saw your son? Evelyn told of Alvin playing in the yard, of the phone call, and of finding the yard empty. Mrs. Patterson confirmed what she said about the van and the two people. Can you describe these people? The detective asked the neighbor. I saw them from a distance, the woman admitted. One was a tall man, the other a woman. I couldn't make out any other details. Detective Blake took down the statement and turned to Evelyn. Mrs. Gray, do you have any idea who might have taken your son? Maybe someone threatened your family? Evelyn hesitated. She realized that this was the moment to tell the truth. There is a woman, she began slowly. Macy Lester. She's Alvin's birth mother. The detective lifted his head from his notepad and looked at her carefully. Go on, he said. Evelyn told the whole story, about Macy's abandonment of her 4-year-old son 3 years ago, about the adoption, about the woman's recent appearance and her demands for the child's return. She also told of the home invasion and threats. Why didn't you report this sooner? The detective asked with some reproach in his voice. We thought we could handle it on our own, Evelyn admitted. We were afraid that if the case went to trial, Alvin might be taken away from us. Detective Blake nodded understandingly. Where is this Macy Lester now? She lives next door, Evelyn pointed across the street, along with her roommate, Taylor Morris. The detective signaled 2 patrolmen, and they headed toward the Lester house. They returned a few minutes later. The house is empty, one of them reported. Looks like the tenants moved out in a hurry. Only the bare necessities are left. Detective Blake immediately put out an APB on Macy Lester and Taylor Morris to all police departments. He also requested information on possible vehicles registered in their names. We have a description of the van from your neighbor, he told Evelyn. It's dark, probably black or dark blue. We'll check all the CCTV cameras in the neighborhood. Meanwhile, Dylan arrived. When he heard about his son's abduction, he turned pale and clenched his fists. I'll kill them, he hissed. If they touch a hair on his head, I'll use my own hands to… Mr. Gray, Detective Blake interrupted him. I understand how you feel, but the important thing right now is to stay calm and help us find your son. Tell me everything you know about these men. Dylan recounted his conversation with Macy and Taylor, how Taylor had threatened him with a tire iron. The detective took careful notes on every detail. Do they have an automobile? He asked. I don't know, Dylan answered. We've never seen them drive a car, but they could have rented a van or stolen one. Detective Blake got the information from the duty officer on the radio. Taylor Morris had convictions for auto theft and assault, as well as several drug offenses. Macy Lester had been previously arrested for DUI and disorderly conduct. They're dangerous, the detective said. Especially Morris. We have to move quickly but carefully. By late afternoon, the search was fruitless. Police checked all the places where the fugitives could be hiding. Abandoned buildings, motels, acquaintances' homes. CCTV cameras recorded a dark van traveling down the main street of the city around 4:30, but the license plate number could not be seen. Evelyn and Dylan had spent the worst night of their lives. They hadn't slept, calling Detective Blake constantly, hoping to hear good news. The house seemed empty and cold without the children's laughter and the stomping of little feet on the stairs. The next morning, Detective Blake called early in the morning. We've got news, he said. We found the van. Evelyn and Dylan went to the scene immediately. The vehicle was found in the woods about 30 kilometers from the city on an abandoned forest road. It was standing empty, the doors were open, and only a few empty beer cans and cigarette butts remained inside. From the tracks, it looks like they got into another car, the detective explained. We found tracks from 2 different cars. One of them is probably their accomplice. Forensics thoroughly examined the van. They found some of Alvin's hair and a piece of fabric from his school shirt, which confirmed that the boy was indeed in that vehicle. But the good news is that there were no signs of struggle or blood, Detective Blake said. That means your son was most likely unhurt. However, the trail was being lost again. The police expanded the search, added additional units, but Macy, Taylor, and Alvin seemed to vanish into thin air. By midday, Detective Blake had received some important information. An informant reported seeing Taylor Morris near the train station in the neighboring town of Beaumont, about 150 kilometers away. Perhaps they plan to leave the state by train, the detective suggested. That makes sense. It's harder to track by train than by automobile. He immediately contacted the Beaumont police and asked for increased surveillance at the train station. At the same time, a rapid response team was prepared to go to the site if the kidnappers were found. The wait was agonizing. Evelyn walked around the house as if in a fog, unable to find her place. Dylan tried several times to drive to Beaumont on his own, but the detective convinced him to stay home in case the kidnappers called. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the call everyone had been waiting for came. "We found them," Detective Blake said over the phone. "They're at the train station in Beaumont, waiting for the 5:30 train to Dallas. We're leaving immediately." "We're coming with you," said Dylan. "No, it's too dangerous," objected the detective. "Stay at home, we'll manage." But Dylan and Evelyn were already getting into the car. They couldn't just sit and wait when their son was in danger. Despite the detective's protests, they drove to Beaumont. The railroad station in Beaumont was small but quite busy. Trains stopped here several times a day, carrying passengers between major Texas cities. The station building had been built back in the 50s and looked a little dilapidated, but functional. Beaumont police had already cordoned off the area, but were doing so discreetly so as not to spook the suspects. Detective Blake arrived with his team just in time. It was less than an hour before the train left. Through binoculars, he saw them in the waiting room. Macy was sitting on a bench, holding Alvin's hand tightly. The boy looked scared and confused, but outwardly unharmed. Taylor stood nearby, looking around nervously and smoking cigarette after cigarette. "Are they armed?" the SWAT team commander asked the detective. "Morris might have a knife or something," Blake replied. "But he has no firearms as far as we know." The plan of operation was simple. Wait until they were heading for the train and take them at the moment of boarding, when there would be less risk to others and to the child. Evelyn and Dylan watched from a police car parked in the parking lot across from the train station. When Evelyn saw her son alive and unharmed, she cried with relief. "He's alive," she whispered. "Our boy is alive." At 5:20, they announced the arrival of the train to Dallas. Macy rose from the bench, still holding Alvin's hand, and Taylor picked up a small travel bag. They headed toward the platform exit. It was at this point that the police sprang into action. Several plainclothes officers surrounded the group, and Detective Blake announced with a megaphone, "Police! Macy Lester and Taylor Morris, you're under arrest. Hands in the air." The reaction was instantaneous. Taylor dropped his bag and tried to run, but he was quickly thrown to the ground and handcuffed. Macy, on the other hand, grabbed Alvin even tighter and began shouting, "That's my son! My son! You have no right!" Alvin, frightened by the shouting and commotion, began to cry and tried to break free from the woman's grasp. The two officers cautiously approached Macy, trying not to frighten the child even more. "Mrs. Lester," one of them said calmly, "let the boy go. No one will hurt you, but you must let the child go." "No," cried Macy, tears streaming down her face. "He's mine. I'm his mother. I have a right to be with him." Alvin cried harder and harder, and his cries echoed throughout the station. Passengers stopped to watch, and some pulled out their phones to take videos. At this point, Evelyn couldn't take it anymore. Despite Dylan's attempts to stop her, she ran out of the car and ran to the platform. "Alvin!" she shouted. "Mommy's here!" Hearing the familiar voice, the boy looked up and saw Evelyn. His face brightened, and he tried with renewed vigor to break free of Macy's grasp. "Mommy! Mommy!" he shouted, holding out his arms to Evelyn. This was the moment the police took advantage of. While Macy was distracted by Evelyn's appearance, one of the officers quickly came up behind her and released the child from her arms. Macy tried to resist, but was quickly handcuffed. Alvin rushed to Evelyn and hugged her tightly, resting his face against her shoulder. The boy shook with fear and relief, and Evelyn stroked his head, whispering soothing words. "It's okay, baby," she said through her tears. "Mommy and Daddy are here. You're safe." Dylan ran over to them and hugged them both. The family was finally reunited, and the nightmare was over. Macy continued to scream as they led her away to the police car. "It's not fair. He's my son. He's my only child. I want to be with him." "You kidnapped a child," Detective Blake said sternly. "That's a serious offense. You will have an opportunity to explain yourself in court." Taylor was also taken away in handcuffs. He didn't resist or scream, but but you could see in his face that he realized the seriousness of his situation. Detective Blake approached the Gray family. "How you doing, buddy?" he asked Alvin, sitting down next to him. "They didn't hurt you?" The boy shook his head, but it was obvious he was still scared. "They made me go with them," he said quietly. "They said that if I shouted, it would be bad. And then we drove for a long time, and I didn't know where we were going." "It's okay now," the detective reassured him. "You're with your parents, and no one else will take you away." The drive home was relatively quiet. Alvin sat between Evelyn and Dylan in the back seat and held their hands tightly. At home, Alvin never left his foster parents' side. He helped Evelyn make dinner, sat next to Dylan while he watched the news, and even asked that they both sit next to his bed while he fell asleep. "Mom," he said before he went to bed, "is that woman really my mom?" Evelyn and Dylan looked at each other. After everything that had happened, they decided it was time to tell their son the truth. "Yes, Alvin," Evelyn said softly. "She gave birth to you. But remember when we talked about being a mom being more than just giving birth to a baby?" The boy nodded. "That woman couldn't take care of you when you were little," Dylan continued. "She was sick and didn't understand how to love and protect children. So you were given to us, and we became your real family." "And now she wanted to take me away?" Alvin asked. "She thought it would be better for you," Evelyn explained. "But she was wrong. Your home is here, with us." Alvin was silent for a moment, thinking about what he had heard. "Is she in prison now?" he asked. "Yes," Dylan answered, "for taking you away without permission." "And she's not coming back?" There was hope in the boy's voice. "No, she won't," Evelyn said firmly. "We won't let that happen." Alvin finally relaxed and hugged his teddy bear tightly. "Okay," he said and closed his eyes. A few weeks later, the trial took place. Macy Lester and Taylor Morris were found guilty of kidnapping a child. Taylor received 5 years in prison, and Macy received 3 years with a condition of compulsory treatment for alcoholism. The court also permanently terminated her parental rights, which meant she could never again claim custody of Alvin.